Joshua Maddux went missing and was found 7 years later, in an abandoned house in the chimney. He was positioned in a way that defies logic. His clothes were neatly folded inside the house. Very bizarre circumstances. Joshua Vernon Maddux disappeared May 8, 2008, Woodland Park, Colorado. Body found August 7, 2015. On May 8, 2008, Josh Maddux, 18, left his house to take a walk. He was a nature lover, so this was nothing unusual. He was never seen alive again. 7 years later, in August 2015, less than a mile away from Josh's home, property developer Chuck Murphy was demolishing an old wood cabin to make way for 32 new family homes. The cabin hadn't been used in years and the inside was damp and rotten. Work to demolish the chimney inside the cabin started, and to the surprise of the demolition team, crammed inside the brickwork was a mummified body, which later was confirmed as Joshua. His body was naked apart from a thin shirt, and his clothes were neatly stacked inside the cabin. What happened to Josh? Did he climb in? Was he forced in? The story of Josh Maddux continues to stir debate amongst armchair detectives. Who was Joshua Maddux? Joshua Maddux was born on March 9, 1990, and lived in Woodland Park, a town of 7,000 to 9,000 people, in the Pike National Forest in Teller County, Colorado. His parents were divorced, and Josh lived with his father Mike and two sisters Kate and Ruth. He was long-haired, 6 feet tall, blonde-haired, and weighed 150 pounds. He had a carefree attitude to life, loved music, spending much of his free time writing music or playing the guitar. At school, he was a bright student and was seemingly well-liked. 2 years before Josh's disappearance, on June 1, 2006, a week before his high school graduation, his older brother, Zachary, 18, committed suicide after suffering from severe depression. Mike Maddux said, "I buried his older brother 2 years before, and it was so difficult on Josh. When his brother died, it pushed him over the edge. It was a big shock for the family and a big shock for Josh. He thought highly of his older brother." Despite this, Josh had been doing well and was happy in the period around 2008. The disappearance of Josh Maddux. On May 8, 2008, Josh left the house, telling his sister Kate that he was going out for a walk. He often went out hiking alone, so when his sister saw him at the house before he left, she thought little of it. But when he failed to return later that evening, the family became worried. On May 13, 5 days after he disappeared, his father, Mike, called the police to report Josh missing. Mike said, "I got up one morning and Josh was there, then he just never came home. The next day he still didn't come home. I called his friends, nobody had seen him. Nobody knows where he is." The search for Josh. The authorities, friends, and family scoured the neighborhood and nearby parkland area where Josh may have decided to go walking. After months of searching, nothing had been uncovered and hopes faded. Josh's sister Kate hoped that he had simply left town to go and play music or start a different life. She wrote of her brother's disappearance. "Since Josh was 18, it has been reasonable to assume he may have decided to leave town to start a new life. As one of his two older sisters, I have always chosen to believe that this was the case. I have expected Josh to return home to my father's house at any time with a wife and small children so that they can meet their grandparents and 2 aunts. Josh has always been known for his musical and literary talent, so maybe we would find him playing music with a band on tour. Or catch him writing successful novels under a pen name so that he could keep his preferred lifestyle of solitude in the woods." The police had no reason to suspect any foul play, and so listed him as a missing person. The body found in the chimney. Chuck Murphy's cabin, where Josh Maddux's corpse was discovered in August 2015. In 2015, Chuck Murphy, 80, a builder from Colorado Springs, was demolishing his old wood cabin on Meadowlark Lane, which was in a large area of land surrounded by tall pines. Chuck had originally purchased the cabin in the 1950s. It had formerly been the homestead of Thunderhead Ranch on Rampart Range Road on Woodland Park's north side. It was an infamous dining, drinking and gambling complex owned by Big Bird Bergstrom in the 1930s to 1950s. He had come to America from Sweden in 1912 and run the Thunderhead Inn as a dining and drinking establishment after the end of Prohibition. He also used the ranch as an illegal gambling and prostitution den, and he was arrested by the FBI. In the subsequent trial, the jury found him not guilty. The cabin hadn't been used for a decade and had fallen into a state of disrepair. Chuck had made the decision to demolish the cabin to make way for property development, and in August 2015, demolition work started. Chuck's brother had lived in the cabin until 2005, but since moving out, it had become a storage facility, and it had been rarely visited. Animals had been a problem, and there was a noticeable stench when Chuck came to the cabin on August 7th. As the workers dismantled the chimney, one of the two in the cabin, using an excavator, and reached the interior, Chuck made the horrific discovery of the body of a young man, cramped into a fetal position with his legs above his head. He called the police, who arrived with the county coroner, who later, with the help of dental records, positively identified the body to be that of the missing man, Joshua Maddux. The Maddux family was shocked by the news of the discovery of Josh's body. His sister Kate said, "The situation doesn't make any sense at all. We were really expecting him to be anywhere else in the world, and he was actually very close. The only thing we can figure is he was being an 18-year-old kid, checking out a cabin. It had already been abandoned for a long time, and a horrible accident happened." The cabin was only 2 blocks from the Maddux family home, yet the searches for Josh had overlooked the building. There had not been any sign of life, and there was no reason to check a chimney there. Chuck Murphy, the cabin owner himself, had rarely visited. However, on the occasions that he had to check in, he himself had not noticed anything unusual about the property. Since the cabin itself stood centrally in a large plot of land, surrounded by tall pines, around 50 feet from the road, police suggested that with no adjacent homes, if Josh had cried for help, no one would have been able to hear him regardless. Further investigation into Josh's death. The Teller County coroner, Al Bourne, did an autopsy and found no evidence of any drugs in Josh's remains. He said, "The hard tissue showed no signs of trauma. There were no broken bones, no knife marks. There were no bullet holes. There is so far no answers to a number of things. It is very confusing." On September 28, 2015, Bourne made a ruling of accidental death. He speculated that Josh had climbed into the chimney and become stuck in the brickwork. Bourne stated that Josh's position in the chimney appeared to have been a voluntary act in order to gain access. He concluded the most likely cause of death was hypothermia, as the temperature around the time of his disappearance between May 8 and 10, 2008, had dropped to the high 20s. Discrepancies in the coroner's report. Many disagreed with the coroner's report. Chuck questioned the coroner's conclusion of accidental death, as the chimney had been built 20 years before, and during its construction, it had been fitted with a thick wire mesh hung from steel hooks used to keep animals and debris from becoming lodged inside the chimney or from entering the cabin itself. Murphy said, "It was a heavy wire grate, a wire mesh. I installed it across the chimney about 1 row of bricks from the top. We didn't want trouble with raccoons and things getting into the chimney." Bourne was of the opinion that the grate could have been rusted or corroded, and further stated, "Nobody saw the metal mesh. We didn't see it in any of our photos. It may have disappeared." Murphy responded that during the demolition, all metalwork had been collected and taken for scrap, which would explain why the mesh was not clearly identified by the coroner, as it wasn't anywhere near the chimney. "They were just gathering up all the steel, angle iron and things as part of the demolition," Murphy said. "They had no idea the mesh had any significance." Conceding to Murphy, Bourne reopened the case 3 days after his initial conclusion. It was not only the rebar that caused doubt. For example, a large wooden breakfast bar that had been torn from a wall in the kitchen and dragged over to block the chimney from inside the cabin. If the breakfast bar had been torn from the wall, then who had done it and why? What was even stranger was that when Josh's body had been found, he was wearing only a thin thermal shirt, and his clothes had actually been found inside the cabin, folded up next to the fireplace. Bourne said of this evidence, "This one really taxed our brains. We found his clothing just outside the firebox. He only had on a thermal t-shirt. We don't know why he took his clothes off, took his shoes and socks off, and why he went outside, climbed on the roof, and went down the chimney. It was not linear thinking. The revised autopsy report said that the cause of death was an accidental death, murder, or undetermined causes." Bourne said, "We've come up with the most plausible explanation, and it will remain an accident. He did come down the chimney, that's our conclusion." Murphy said, "There's no way that guy crawled inside that chimney with that steel webbing. He didn't come down the chimney." And he remained convinced that Josh's death had been no accident, adding, "He was only wearing his thermal shirt. No pants. No shoes or socks." Murphy said was ridiculous to think the teen stripped down to just his shirt, climbed up on the roof and then the chimney and slid down, knowing he'd be trapped. Theories on the Josh Maddux death and the Andy Newman link. The police received several anonymous tip-offs suggesting leads and naming suspects that had bragged of killing Josh. One such suspect was now incarcerated in a Texas jail and had previous time in Seattle and Portland prisons with a long history of violent crime. One tip-off had informed police that this man had been seen with Josh. When speaking of the man, Al Bourne said, "They can't give me times and specifics, and we can't generate stuff that goes back 7 years. Bourne also doubted that the man would have been able to have put Josh in the chimney alone. According to a Reddit post, Josh was known to hang around a murderer named Andy. Several of us went to the cops saying, "Yo, Josh who went missing was last seen with Andy who's a murderer, maybe you should check that out." Despite a fair amount of pestering, nothing ever really came of it, and by nothing, I mean that the police mostly didn't even return our calls. And once accidentally cancelled the bulletin on Josh because he's alive and well and living in the next town over. He was actually in the chimney of an abandoned cabin like 2 blocks from his parents' house. The coroner said the body had been there for about 7 years, and ruled the death accidental, concluding that Josh had probably climbed down the chimney in an attempt to break into the house and gotten stuck. Which, given the age of the corpse, doesn't seem overly ridiculous. Except for the fact that in addition to Josh having last been seen with Andy immediately before his stabbing spree, people called in to report having heard rumors that Andy bragged about getting rid of Josh. Somebody had ripped a heavy bar off the wall in the kitchen and propped it against the fireplace. Or the fact that Josh's stuff was already inside the cabin, meaning he'd already broken in, and would have had to lock himself out to have to go for the chimney. And he might have noticed that either the flue or the big bar would have prevented him from getting into the fireplace. So why keep going? Conclusions on the case. Chuck Murphy, the owner of the cabin, said, "It's a real conundrum. A tragic, terrible story. All I know is he did not go down that chimney. He got in the fireplace and went up. But why? I think it will remain a mystery. One of those sad stories. The case is bizarre and perplexing. The bar in the chimney would have prevented the entry of anyone unless it really was removed prior to the demolition or rusted away as suggested by the coroner. Why would Josh remove his clothes and leave by the fireplace as well as his boots? Why was the breakfast bar dragged to cover the entrance of the fireplace inside the cabin?